Okay, thank you guys. So for those of you who join us, this is the plan of the presentation. There are 4 parts to it. We've covered the first 2 parts. In the first part, under 1, I covered why 2 things. I explained why I approached the problem of imitation in Kierkegaard in relation to the notion of mimesis. I gave just a very brief introduction to 2 major considerations of imitation or mimesis in the literature that we have in Plato and Aristotle. I showed how Kierkegaard joins the conversation, and under the second point there, we've covered the concept of repetition in Kierkegaard. We established that imitation, understood as repetition, is very present in the work itself, and that Kierkegaard uses the concept of repetition to account for a meaningful existence in time. Okay. Now we're moving to the concept of redoubling reduplication. This is either one could either think about those 2 words as representing one concept or as 2. I see them as being very close to each other, but if someone were to kind of delineate how they are different, I wouldn't really very much argue. I thought I will just maybe be less focused on quotations while presenting this concept in Kierkegaard, but be more descriptive. So redoubling reduplication, but also double reflection, indirect communication, and plus already discussed repetition are Kierkegaard's mimetic categories of transformation that allow for coming into existence. So while repetition was mostly focused on accounting for existence, a meaningful existence in time, I believe that Kierkegaard uses the categories of redoubling reduplication to kind of move further away with his agenda to show the importance of human transformation, and that transformation occurs on several levels, on moral level, but also on the existential level. These concepts involve the exercise of such virtues as accountability, but also as of Kierkegaard's very specific concept of interest, of being interested in, invested in a sense in action and transformation, and they entail a dialectical pair of unity and duality. It is worth first noting the general mimetic quality already embedded in them, which is characterized by specific mimetic doubleness, twofoldness of those words. It's already detectable in the very words, right? We just hear them as we hear repetition, redoubling, reduplication, but especially reduplication and redoubling. We have those kind of, there's so much happening. There's some sort of doubleness over there, twofoldness over there. Interestingly, a duplicate is already a copy of something, a representation of something. So to reduplicate a duplicate is a highly imitative undertaking, which suggests that one is departing further away from the original, right? So we don't have just duplication or doubling, right? We have redoubling. So there's this kind of processual element to that kind of moves towards a further mimetic activity behind them. So, 2 with the double reflection. If we take reflection, which is another concept that is at stake here, and by the way, I should maybe have said that I look at mimesis in Kierkegaard in a sense, taking seriously Wittgenstein's theory of family resemblance. I don't really focus on one thing and they say, oh, we have to nail it down. The concept, we see how it differs from other concepts, we need to find its signifier, definitions, so on and so forth. But I try to understand mimesis very broadly as by looking at concepts around it, or concepts it denotes. So too with double reflection. If we take reflection as a semblance of something else, double reflection is a reflection of a reflection. Similarly, redoubling suggests that a double, which is already an increase, a development or reproduction of something, is redoubled, which means multiplied on a larger scale. The case of indirect communication, a concept that is kind of in a sense attached to those two, provides an analogous example. Communication requires two, not one. Otherwise we have a monologue, right? It is important to notice that these highly mimetic concepts are fundamental to Kierkegaard's theory of existence. This is coming it's becoming recognized more and more in the current scholarship, but it hasn't been always the case. In turn, this shows that mimesis is at stake both in Kierkegaard's ethical, religious, and aesthetic production. This is to say that, looking at the very structure of his theory of human becoming, one should see a particular dialectic of Kierkegaard's authorship that holds in tension the aesthetic with the existential. So for those of you who are not that much familiar with Kierkegaard's production, there is this general reading that the three stages of existence in Kierkegaard, the aesthetic, the ethical, the religious, should be very different. And while there could be some interaction between bordering stages of existence or of life views, so for example, aesthetic, ethical, or ethical, religious, there's definitely a huge gap between the aesthetic and the religious, right? Or the aesthetic and the fully existential, the highest form of existence. So this is to say that looking at the very structure of his theory of human becoming, one should see a particular dialectic of Kierkegaard's authorship that holds in tension the aesthetic with existential. The common ground I find among these categories is mimesis. So I use this category of mimesis to actually understand Kierkegaard's authorship better. So there's again double movement in my approach. On the one hand, I try to understand mimesis in Kierkegaard's authorship, right? But on the other hand, I use the concept as such to understand Kierkegaard's authorship better. The common ground I found among these categories is mimesis, but comprehended in an Aristotelian way, as a phenomenon that involves perfection and demands action. This we had covered in the first part of the presentation. The major considerations of redoubling, reduplication, double reflection, repetition, indirect communication occur in Kierkegaard's pseudonymous writings and journals. And that was always often the case, that because they were covered in, or they appeared in the pseudonymous authorship, especially this aesthetic authorship, they were treated as of minor importance for Kierkegaard. I don't think that's right. The concept of redoubling is first encountered in Kierkegaard's pseudonymous work Repetition, which we've covered. The association of the eponymous main concept of this work with redoubling occurs in two of the letters from the young man to his silent confidant. So the first, we have the report in the book Repetition. That's just basically the book Repetition opens with the report of Constantine Constantius, of which name is very repetitive in itself. And then we have those two. Then we have the second part, in which we have the letters from the young man to his silent confidant. Redoubling there is related to Job's blessing in receiving everything double, except the life of his children. So Kierkegaard assumes that we are familiar, as his readers, we are familiar with the story of Job. And, well, today that story probably needs to be retold in today's day. So the idea is that in the Bible, in the Old Testament, there's a story where Satan comes to God and says, all those who follow, to obey you, they do that because they have, they get something out of it. And God says, no, that's not really the case. And Satan says, I just kind of went about and checked that, all those, there's no one who is an exception. And God says, look at Job. So Satan says, okay, let's have a deal. If I just basically do something bad or allow something bad happen to Job, would he be really such a good, obedient, someone who is obedient to your laws and just, not a good Christian, right? Because we don't have Christianity yet, but someone who is just a pious, inhabitant of this planet. And God says, yeah, sure, just bring it on, do whatever, and just kill his children, take away the whatever he possesses, and then we'll see. That's fair enough, no problem. And then and that happens. And Kierkegaard takes to read that book to account for some sort of redoubling, repetition, that it happens. But he's trying to say that this redoubling does not happen in flesh. It's not about physical, material redoubling, but it has some sort of a different dimension. And here he comes with this concept of redoubling and repetition. So he says, redoubling there is related to, I've read that, the true repetition of the spirit is juxtaposed in contradiction with the repetition of worldly possessions. Redoubling is associated with the former type of repetition. Okay, so he's trying to say that redoubling, you see the continuity, redoubling is the repetition in the spiritual sense. The interesting case that Job gets new children. God keeps him the same wife, by the way. This is part of that persecution plan, maybe. She's there and she's kind of mocking him, just talking. And so he has children, but they're not the same children, right? So you see, Kierkegaard is thinking about repetition or imitation, but with a difference. There is some sort of difference there. Another entry regarding redoubling in relation to repetition appears in Johannes Climacus' work De Omnibus Dubitandum, as everything needs to be doubted. It's important to notice that redoubling and reduplication span in themselves a certain duality, which is reality and ideality. We had that already in repetition. The first definition of redoubling can be found in another work of Johannes Climacus, Philosophical Fragments. And here it is. Do I have it here? Yes, I do. It's over there. Yet coming into existence can contain within itself a redoubling. For doubling, put it there. That is a possibility of coming into existence with its own coming to existence. Right? This is interesting. So there is a double, some sort of coming in existence. It's not just a one movement, but it's a double movement. So there is much more happening in there. And what's important is that what Kierkegaard is really trying to drive on, which is a very specific understanding of existence, as something that is coming again. Redoubling refers to the double movement of becoming an individual. On the one hand, the individual, due to the fact of mere being in the world, has its own historical point of beginning. On the other hand, quote, the more special historical coming into existence come into existence by way of relatively freely acting cause, which in turn definitively points to an absolutely freely acting cause. The gist of it is just basically that the human existence must become in time. It must be a historical event. But the problem is how to marry some sort of spiritual coming into existence, some sort of kind of spiritual dimension of human being with the physical, right? It's coming in time. So he tries to address some of those questions in some other of his works, such as Christian discourses. In Christian discourses, Kierkegaard points to the difference between the man and the bird. In Redoubling, the man has two beginnings. One is his historical existence, while other arises in the chance of becoming in the eternal way to be itself before God. It's a complicated phrase, but the idea is that the realm of nature cannot become into spiritual existence. I mean, animals are, according to Kierkegaard, what they are by the very nature of what they are. What they do, they cannot deviate from that. But humans have that capacity to, while existing in time on the surface of the planet, they can actually also come into existence in a more nuanced, profound way, spiritual way. And that existence is qualified by existing in relation to something that is of ultimate importance to someone. And that's what Kierkegaard calls God. Well, he's a pseudonymous author. Redoubling is introduced in a discussion again in another of his works, Postscript. It deals with the being and becoming of the truth. Truth is redoubling when the relation of adequacy, the is of the truth, is accentuated. Climacus identifies redoubling, which here is an abstract aspect of the truth comprehended in an idealistic manner, with reduplication, saying, quote, when for existing spirit, there is a question about truth, that abstract reduplication of truth recurs. So what he's trying to say here is that on the one hand, we can have a knowledge of what truth is, how we should act, right? But the other thing is when we actually actualize that knowledge in real life, and it can have very kind of daily kind of implications, such as if I know that it's the right thing to help someone, and I have that knowledge about that. If I don't actualize that, I cannot be a morally good person. So for Kant, for example, I'm just simplifying things just to give you a background. So for Kant would say something along the lines, it's important, it's good enough if you know the regulative principle for human conduct. But for Kierkegaard, just to simplify this, you can be a morally good person as soon as you actualize that principle in real life. Obviously there are limitations to what Kierkegaard is saying, but that's kind of the background for that. Okay, in Works of Love, which is another of his works, this one he actually signs. So this is scholars of Kierkegaard would say this is the place, this is a space, textual space where Kierkegaard is actually saying what he really means. Let's just leave it like that for now. In Works of Love, Kierkegaard introduces the concept of redoubling to explain his non-preferential love as a spiritual category. However, what has been ignored by scholars is that redoubling shows that non-preferential love entails imitation, entails mimesis. To love without preferential scope is to love the other as one's neighbor. For, quote from the Works of Love, the concept neighbor is actually redoubling of one's own self, end quote. Redoubling signifies a change within the individual spirit, according to which the individual renounces loving preferentially those who are close to him, family, beloved, friend, on account of loving others as oneself. So what he's trying to say here is that you have two types of love. I mean, there's plenty, but he's just for the sake of the discussion. You have a preferential love, which is very natural to you, which is very kind of natural to human beings. It's very tribal. It's very evolutionary, right? We love people that are close to us. Children love their parents. Parents love their children. Partners love each other, right? So this is something. Then there's like a concentric kind of thing, right? You love people close to you. Then you have friends, acquaintances, and so forth. And it basically means that if you were supposed to act in a certain way towards your family member or towards someone who you don't know, you would have some sort of natural motivations for that, right? So, Kant would say no, that's wrong, because you have to basically act in a universal manner. You have to take principle in a universal sense. You have to treat everyone equally, as long as everyone is a human being, Right? Kierkegaard would agree with that in a sense, but he would say, his reasoning is different. He would say, you have to see in the other yourself. Right? You have to treat yourself, you have to treat the other in a moral sense, but your point of departure is self-love. Right? You have to love yourself, and then you have to love your neighbors. So that's the reasoning. On the other hand, in the light of redoubling, loving the other has a mimetic dimension. The other becomes a redoubled self, to which the one has a duty. To love oneself is to love the other, right? So the other is the redoubled self in a sense. Obviously, there are problems there. For example, aren't we just maybe here reducing the other to ourselves? Is there something wrong that's happening over there? Obviously, but it's a matter of a different discussion. Moreover, non-preferential love encompasses the per-duality unity and calls for refiguring action as redoubling, which links the outward and the inward of the existential in an individual by expressing outwardly what he held as true inwardly in the individual. It's a longer thing, but let me just unpack it. The one who loves is or becomes what he does. Right? So he's kind of returning to this idea which I kind of portrayed earlier on, that loving is actually the act of love is actually is related to existence. That loving is actually becoming what one does. In other words, in love one loving expresses that he is in love. The love of the neighbor is not just a pure concept. On the contrary, it is executed in action. The ideality of love is repeated and becomes reality. So the idea here is that, what I'm trying to find here is that this transition from knowing that you have to love your neighbor and actually doing that, I see that as a mimetic thing. That you imitate something that you internalize, but you need to also externalize it. That's how I see that. An imperfect human being can be either in an imaginary being like a mathematical idea, not having the difference in itself, or can be just a, quote, vanishing being, having the difference outside itself. Conversely, the being of righteousness has this perfection, that it contains redoubling. Right? This redoubling that it contains in itself is the difference between being right and wrong. So when Kant would say the difference between a moral person and non-moral person would be to know the right regulative idea or not to know it. Right? But for Kant, for Kierkegaard, is the difference between right and wrong is redoubling. It's actually doing the actual thing. The righteous being is righteous because it is its inner characteristic, the characteristic of its spirit, and because his actions are represented, they represent righteousness, right? They redouble it. So what Kierkegaard would like us to have, in a sense, some sort of, in an Aristotelian sense, following the virtue ethics theory of ethics, that you have to have some sort of predispositions you have to kind of cultivate some sort of predispositions, and this we're coming back to the problem of habituation. And it's not something that is ultimately negative in Kierkegaard. Habits are not ultimately negative, but there is some sort of idea of habituation that is actually good. So if you can, in a sense, embed the habit of loving others as yourself, you don't really have to think too much on that, right? Kant would ask you to reflect. Is it the regulative idea? Would you consider it pertaining to you and every member of society? Can you universalize it? But Kierkegaard says something like that. If you want to love others, become love. So it will be easy, for you to instantiate that in real life. Righteousness is expressed in choosing between right and wrong, and therefore resembling that resembles what has been declared as of Aristotle's concept of imitation, that it involves an act of deliberately choosing the right actions, in a sense, right? But it's not just simply considering the alternative in that sense. Okay, now I'm moving to another work by Kierkegaard, which is the work which is called Practicing Christianity, or as it is being translated also as Training Christianity. And the very title of that work also has the mimetic quality. In training, right? In training, practice, habituation. Which shows that Christianity, or being a Christian according to Kierkegaard, or being, you know, a human being as such, if you just want to kind of reduce it to maybe a secular context, is not something that you get like that, but you are kind of, you have to train yourself in becoming that, in doing that. In Anticlimacus, which Anticlimacus is another of Kierkegaard's pseudonyms, in Anticlimacus' Practicing Christianity, both redoubling and reduplication reappear predominantly in a context of indirect communication. It can be, the concept can be formed in two ways. The difference between them lies in the relation between the communication and the communicator. When the so this is another field of Kierkegaard's interest in, which is qualified by imitation, which is the communication. When the communicator, someone who communicates, is absent from the communication as a subject, quote, the communicator is a zero, a non-person, and an objective something. The redoubling of communication is then present in the unity of opposites. Communication is of the subjective, but the communicator is a disinterested medium. So on the one hand, we can have a, so it's a complex thing, but you have communicator, and then you have a recipient of it, and then you have a communication. So how I read it is that the right type of communication, the one that is really taking place in the existential sense, is that which has invested both the communicator and the recipient, and also the communication has existential meaning. The other way is when the communicator is the reduplication of the communication, and therefore is present as the subject of communication. So on the one hand, you have some sort of, you can have a disinterested communicator as some sort of a teacher who tells you do X, Y, Z, right? And this can be helpful. This can be, you know, in the normative sense, you may know what things are to be done. But there is another level of communication when the communicator, the one who communicates, actually is what he says is the right thing to do. Right? So when the communicator, so imagine your parent your parent smokes, for example, right? And they tell you smoking is bad. Right? Or imagine, or different scenario, which one would be more accurate? Imagine your parent says, I don't smoke, you've never seen them smoking, they don't even have to say that I don't smoke. You see them not smoking, right? And they say smoking's bad. Which communication would be more kind of at work, right? Which one would work more? This is what Kierkegaard is thinking about, and he believes that this communication that is actually, in a sense, reduplicated or represented in the one who communicates, is actually, it will work better. Redoubling and reduplication serve in exposing the qualitative difference between the thought of the individual and its action. Indirect communication that is possible through redoubling and reduplication is the proper way of communicating the eternal truth. Indirect communication and redoubling comprise mental consideration of action expressed in a choice, and therefore as such are to be understood as mimetic concepts in the sense of Aristotelian mimesis. However, direct communication is also mimetic. For example, Kierkegaard has an example of martyr who says, you know, there's this idea of martyrdom in Kierkegaard towards the end of his authorship, that someone who communicates the truth of Christianity is someone who actually becomes a true Christian, which for Kierkegaard is becoming a martyr, right? So if you become a martyr, if you die for truth, this is the real communication, right? This is the direct communication. So some truth, just to summarize this long passage, some truths can be communicated in a successful manner when they are represented in the communicator's life, and these are truths of existence, and some other truths can be communicated in the indirect sense. That's the gist of it. Okay, before we go to the next section, just the caveat here, the problem of redoubling reduplication is not dealt by Kierkegaard in a very systematic manner. So hence it's really kind of difficult to kind of make sense out of it throughout his authorship. He just gives you a little line here, a little line there. So my work in that respect was meant to kind of try to make some sort of systematic reading of the problem of reduplication, how reduplication kind of qualifies different areas in Kierkegaard's authorship. Okay. Now we'll go to the last section of my presentation on the image and the prototype. And there is more. Now you have more. There will be more quotes because Kierkegaard deals with this problem in a more systematic manner. But my idea for kind of coming with this structure for the presentation was to show that Kierkegaard starts with repetition. Then at a certain point he drops that. He comes with the concepts of reduplication, redoubling, and he, in a sense, it doesn't drop the subject as such, but he kind of minimizes its importance, and then he moves to the subject of prototype, which a prototype is someone who actually expresses direct communication, right? A pure, it's a perfect redoubling, perfect reduplication. Okay. Finally, we'll speak about Kierkegaard's most prominent engagement of mimesis, featured in his conceptualizations of the prototype and the image in his philosophy. Both the prototype and the image are fundamental when discussing Kierkegaard's engagement with the tradition Imitatio Christi. For Kierkegaard, and it seems to be common knowledge among those who did some work on Kierkegaard, Christ is Kierkegaard uses this figure of Christ as the prototype of human existence, or sometimes he says Christ is the prototype of human existence. Sometimes he says that Christ is the prototype of Christian existence, right? And actually, he kind of stresses more the latter. So just to give you a bit of a background for this thing. So the general idea in the Kierkegaardian scholarship is that imitation in Kierkegaard is about the imitation of Christ. Period. So with the whole talk and with my scholarship, I'm trying to challenge that, and I'm doing that. So I will say something about the problem of the prototype. I'm trying to understand the problem of the prototype, not really focusing on those Christian tropes. They will be there, but I'm trying to understand what is actually at work, what he really means to say. So let's have a look at two passages from his journals and papers. And it's important that Kierkegaard, have a general view of Kierkegaard's production. Kierkegaard produces his works, he publishes them, pseudonymous works, signed works. Then he has journals. In those journals, he often comments on those works he writes. He also explains to the potential reader what is actually happening between in those works and also between those different pseudonymous authors. That's why it's useful to look into those journal entries. Okay, so I'll start with the first quotation. It goes as follows. It would be the most fearful anguish for a person if he understood Christ in such a way that he only became his prototype, and now, by his own efforts, he would resemble the prototype. And here it is. Christ is simultaneously the prototype, and precisely because he is that absolutely, he is also the prototype who can be approached through the help of the prototype himself. It's a bit confusing, actually, right? When you think about it. How do you want to approach a prototype with the help of the prototype, through the help of the prototype, right? The second quotation goes as follows. As soon as the category, the single individual, goes out, Christianity is abolished. Then the individual will relate to God through the race. through an abstraction, through a third party. And then Christianity is eo ipso abolished. If this happens, then the God-man is a phantom instead of an actual prototype. Okay, let's unpack those quotations. Both journal entries show that Christ is the prototype of Christian existence. We can read it also as human existence. What does it mean? It means very generally to be a Christian, or if we do a bit of reduction here, to be a human being fully, right? It means to imitate Christ. But both the act of imitation and the understanding of Christ as the prototype need substantial qualification. In both cases, Kierkegaard does not shy away from paradoxes. And let's look at the first quote. Right? So we see this. Christ is something very general. Christ is the prototype then that must be resembled. It's there, right? And 2, Christ can be approached by the help of Christ. While it is a challenge to approach Christ, Christ offers help in how to approach Christ. Right? In a sense, it is. We don't have much time for that, but in a sense, it is the same problem that Plato and Aristotle have, right? How to imitate properly? Well, we have to have a knowledge. We have to have a knowledge what the true thing is and what the appearances are. So we have to have some sort of knowledge, right? But Aristotle will say, but we already are imitative creature, by nature. It's something innate. We imitate by nature, right? So the problem is, can we identify Christ? How do we identify Christ the right prototype, right? The answer is through Christ. Right. So you see the paradoxicality there. Let's look at the second quote. This quote shows a bit of a Kierkegaard's heterodoxy, right? He says here, as soon as the category of the single individual goes out, Christianity is abolished, which means to be a Christian, one needs to be the single individual. Right? So to be a Christian, one needs to be a single individual. So that would mean that those who consider themselves Christians are not single individuals, right? Like someone from my group of friends, they would not care about the idea of the single individuality, right? Of individuality, there, right? So there is some sort of precondition there, right? So you cannot imitate Christ. The other thing is that what sort of imitation is at stake here? Is it so obvious here? Well, it's not that obvious, but Kierkegaard gives us some clues here in the second quotation, that you cannot imitate Christ in groups. It's not a communal endeavor, right? And what Kierkegaard does here, he actually qualifies an important part of the study of mimesis, imitation, which is contagion, crowd behavior, right, or the phenomenon of fashion. So what I'm trying to say is that the imitation of Christ is not so simple. It's very paradoxical to understand what it is really about, what the very resembling here is, right, in the first quotation, right. And the other thing is that there are certain prerequisites to be engaged in that endeavor. Okay, here are another two quotations. The first one goes as follows. But Christ is essentially the prototype. Fair enough. Therefore, be leader, right? Therefore, we should be like him, not merely reap benefits from here, right? So, but the interesting bit here is that what verb is used to describe the imitation? It's being like someone. It's not resemble. It's not follow after, like Vogelster or something, right? So there is some sort of likeness that is really at stake here. The second quotation, the religious prototypes, plural, right? It's not one. He doesn't say prototypes or moral prototypes, but he says the religious prototypes. So he talks about not one prototype, but it's more than one. The religious prototypes are frequently very abstract. We do not see them tested and tried in ordinary human sufferings, in sickness, in physical weakness, and all that goes with it. So returning to the third quotation, which is, first on this slide. The third quotation talks about liking oneself to Christ. The verb is ligne here. The fourth quotation talks about a multiplicity of religious prototypes. This we do not see, according to Kierkegaard, what he says, tested and tried in ordinary human sufferings, in sickness and physical weakness, and all that goes with it. They are not so. So the question is, are these prototypes, put this way, is Christ really the good prototype for us? Was he really tested in all those manners, right? So you have another layer of paradoxicality, right? So religious prototypes are abstract, they're not good enough. There are some there is also a fragment when he says we need religious prototypes. So here's ambivalent there. But that's interesting. Do we really just having some vague understanding of Christianity, do we really have Christ tested in ordinary human sufferings, right? In sicknesses, in physical. Do we really have accounts of Christ like that in the Gospels? And the key word is here the ordinary, right? It's answers to and elaborations of some of these problems we find in an analysis of the relation between Kierkegaard's use of image and prototype and the unique relationship between the two. We find in a good understanding of those oppositions. So we have to focus on what really is at stake in the Vorbilde, in the English translation of Vorbilde. The English translation of Vorbilde as prototype seems to be very problematic. There are several. There's prototype, but there's also paradigm, I think, in Swenson translation. But in English, the translation of Vorbilde means prototype. It seems to be problematic in many ways. Prototype denotes something primary but not fully valuable, right? So, like if a company is about to, just produce a car or something, right? They always start with a prototype, and then they test it. Probably pattern. Maybe pattern would be a better word for a translation. Often we associate prototype with a means of testing before we devise something on a large scale or in a more complete form. In Danish, Vorbilde includes bilde. But it seems that the word type in English already denotes that we understand what we understand as Vorbilde. So we have in Danish Vorbilde and in English prototype. So I think the usage for those two words is that in Vorbilde, which means prototype or pattern, there is already a word bilde, which means image. So prototype has this, in itself is this image, right? So prototype or proto-image, right? Type, prototype. This could mean that a prototype is no more than a type. The usage of pattern seems more promising as it does not suggest an improvement upon Christ and his work. So if you have a prototype, you can actually improve. But maybe that's actually not a bad idea. It also corresponds with Kierkegaard's metaphor for imitation as an act of walking and following in someone's footsteps, right? But interestingly, I don't have the quotation here, but interestingly, Kierkegaard says at a certain point, to follow Christ is to walk alone. So there is some interesting stuff here. However, if we consider image as already a representation of something, something other, a more nuanced meaning appears to be at work in bilede, which means a pattern and image. This is to say that prototype becomes a form of super representation, which as such incorporates or entails a variety of types. One finds an interesting case that exemplifies that state of affairs in a theological discussion on the theory of Christophany among the Church Fathers. In brief, some scholars believe that Old Testament contains pre-incarnated appearances of Christ, which could be rendered as some sort of Christ. I know it's not a class in some sort of, I don't know, theology or early Christian studies or something like that. It's kind of interesting to how others dealt with that problem. However, Augustine famously disagrees with this problem in his De Trinitate, believing that each Christophany is theophany, an appearance of the Trinity as a whole at once. So it's not just, we don't have those particular appearances of Christ, for example. Think about Fear and Trembling, that Isaac is being put to death, and maybe I think Origen or someone said, it's a description of, kind of God killing, allowing Jesus to be crucified, something like that, right? But it's more about just a representation of God. For us, the problem of the prototypes would mean that Christ can be represented by several images, but none of these can do it fully. The issue with bilede for bilede reappears in Kierkegaard's engagement with the scriptures, especially considered against the backdrop of the conceptual per imago Dei imitatio Christi. This is the thing here. And there's not much done in that area in Kierkegaard's studies, but I think it's very promising. It would seem that the concept of imago Dei in the Old Testament, it basically means that God created us in His image. Right? Imago Dei, we are created in God's image. It would seem that the concept of imago Dei in the Old Testament, according to which a human being is already an imitation of God. So we don't really need to do much work, because we're already there. Right? We are already created in the image of God. Clashes with the concept of imitatio Christi in the New Testament, according to which Jesus is the perfect image of God. So the problem is that on the one hand, imago Dei, we are there, created in the image of God, but on the other hand, we have to imitate Christ, right? To be God's people, right? The problem is how to reconcile the fact that we as human beings are already created in the image of God with the imitation of the prototype, which sets the standard for the task of an appropriate imitation of God. That's the problem. And I mean, there are explanations for that from theological perspectives. I mean, theologians are really, they do it well if kind of squaring out those problems. But I think this is a serious philosophical problem. Moreover, the question is whether the imitation of Christ is an imitation of God or an imitation of an image of God. So there's plethora of things, because if Christ is already an image of God, you're not imitating the God, but image. So you have the problem of Vorstellung, of representation. How does imitation work in relation to the problem of the prototypes? At first, looking at the very structure of Kierkegaard's imitation, we discern a fundamental relationship between an imitator and that which is being imitated, the object of imitation, which the Dane calls the prototype. We find that imitation is a form of a movement, which he understands dialectically. So we are coming back to repetition. On the one hand, it is the imitator's pursuit to conform one's life to the prototype, the movement from the imitator towards the realm of the ideal, the prototype. On the other hand, it is making an attempt, quoting, making an attempt to place the prototype into actuality, which is the movement from the ideal to the actual. And I understand it as a movement up and movement down. Right? So imitation is a kind of double movement. Do I have a... No, I don't. So I'll read you a quote that kind of... This one, sorry guys. As soon as there is a prototype, there is an obligation to imitation. What does imitation mean? It means striving to conform my life to the prototype. And by the way, imitation, another word for imitation would be conformity, right? To conform. So the prototype is there in the Platonic sense, and now I have to conform my life to the prototype. This is what Christendom calls piety, fear of God. If, however, someone makes an attempt to place the prototype into actuality, says Kierkegaard, in such a way that discipleship or imitation might get to be in earnest, then they say this is blasphemy. That's another quotation, but it shows that it's about placing the prototype, kind of bringing the idea down. Accordingly, mimesis understood as imitation is a double movement that engages two spheres, the sphere of the subject and the sphere of the prototype. And it's the same as with the communication, right? You have direct communication, indirect communication. In the communicator, you need the communication as such, as some sort of eventual thing, and the recipient. The imitative action is in its structure analogous to a vector quantity structure. Drawing on that analogy, one can say that imitation is a relation that comprises two opposite directions, a movement directed towards the realm of the prototype, a movement up, and a movement that is directed at bringing the realm of the prototype to actuality, a movement down. Imitation, so described, resembles Plato's rendering of that concept presented in the Republic, I hinted upon previously. An imitator is like a guardian or a philosopher who initially engages ideals in her own life before implementing them into the realm of the polis. And this is what Plato says in the Republic. Although, as one can rightfully argue, the actuality Kierkegaard has in mind is the actuality of a concrete human being, not the polis, imitation has an ethical and social dimension, right? So we kind of go into the realm of ideals and bring those ideals down. Therefore, what we can see from this juxtaposition is that Kierkegaard's imitation refers to the two pairs of movements and figures. So we have the imitator and the imitated model, right? But also movement from up and down, from actuality to the ideality and back. Having noted that, it seems that the natural thing to embark upon in our exposition of Kierkegaard's imitation would be to explore the exclusivity of the relation between an imitator, a would-be Christian or would-be perfect human being, and the pattern for imitation. While the general grasp of the relation of the authentic self with the prototype presupposes that the relation is between an individual and Christ, we find in plenty of journal entries in Kierkegaard references to plurality of prototypes. For example, a journal entry from 1850 commenting on how Kierkegaard is continuously misunderstood in society discloses that misunderstanding comes from the difference that is located in the contrasting categories that are respectively fundamental for both parties. He says, quote, "My contemporaries have only worldly categories. Thus they expected and expect either that I would escape my mistreatment by taking a journey, for example, or that I will defend myself. I am, however, engrossed with the religious prototypes, whose identifying mark is suffering." So we had that negative account of prototypes. You know, they cannot really they're abstract, cannot represent suffering, right? In the previous, don't have to script there, but now he's saying, actually, no, I am one of those prototypes. I live among them, and those prototypes are qualified by suffering. An interesting remark, considering the prototypes, appears in another of his journal entries from the same year. Quote, "It will always be true of the prototypes that in contemporaneity their contemporaries will feel sorry for them as the most unfortunate of people. They will be victorious after their death." So again, you have some sort of prototypes. In light of receiving Christ as the unique religious prototype, or simply the prototype, whose work and power are sufficient in leading a single individual into Christ-likenesses, introducing additional supportive or derivative mimetic models it's very problematic. And I'll just maybe skip. There's a section when I deal with how scholars dealt with the problem of religious prototypes. They call them derivative prototypes or anonymous prototypes following Kierkegaard, but without actually explaining how those prototypes work with Christ as the prototype. Even we have Apostle Peter, who is actually called or Apostle Paul, who calls himself, a prototype in a sense in the Bible, right? He says, "Imitate me," right? So as I imitate Christ. So this is how I see the problem of prototypes in Kierkegaard. I hope you can see it from the back. I believe that Kierkegaard, so my reading of his authorship I try to identify plurality of prototypes in his work. So I think my understanding is that Kierkegaard does two things. On the one hand, he stresses the importance or the uniqueness of Christ as the prototype, but he also includes in his writings a variety of some additional prototypes, which are also important for both human existence in a more general sense and Christian existence in a more narrow sense. So here is a diagram. So we have internal prototypes and external. So internal prototypes are some universal structures of human self. So Kierkegaard talks about, for example, in his journal entries about the ideal self, what an ideal self would be, what sort of requirements an ideal self needs to meet. He also talks about the ideal picture of being a Christian, which is interesting. There is a picture there, right? For bilede, right? There's a picture. There's a interesting thing there. So there is some sort of mental representation we can produce in our mind. And he also, Kierkegaard, talks about a negative model when he says, like, I am not a truly Christian being, or I'm not an ideal human being, right? And this example actually represents what we have in studies of mimesis as basically being a negative model, right? So you can say, do this as as she does, or don't smoke as your uncle does, right? So you have negative, some sort of exemplarity, right? Then we have external figures, so these are some sort of patterns for some sort of templates for human existence that we Kierkegaard present as internal to us, and then you have external figures, right? So he talks about the lily and the bird in his sign authorship as being the model for imitation. We need to resemble, follow them in some sense, right? He says, if you are like the lily and the bird are, you become a Christian, right? He says that. Then he talks about the job as the model or ideal for imitation in terms of how Job deals with suffering, right? Or Job's faith, that despite the fact that he has clear evidences that everything was taken away from him, with minor with minor exclusions, he will receive those things back. He has that hope. And lastly, we have a woman who was a sinner from the Bible, from the Gospel, someone who who's a model who should be imitated, right? Because she had this very direct relationship with Christ. And I think I'll stop here because I think I should do so. I mean, I have much more to say about that, but I think we can maybe unpack some of those things. So here's the summary. What I'm trying to say is that first, that Kierkegaard joins a very interesting conversation about mimesis that has been formulated by an exchange between Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle's response to Plato, to be more precise. He comes with the idea of repetition, which is his attempt at thinking about imitation as taking seriously human daily experience. He talks about how it qualifies human movement, human imagination, and human existence. When he talked about redoubling, reduplication, it could be a bit vague, and I'm still trying to make more sense out of that, because Kierkegaard is very vague in presenting those categories, and we don't have so much material to work on, right? And some ideas are overlapping there, but there are some still problems I cannot really make sense of myself. And then I show that if we look at the problem of the prototype and prototypes in relation to mimesis and the complexity that there is in Kierkegaard's authorship, we can actually have a maybe more beneficial, more round, wholesome reading of the problem in his work. Thank you.